Welcome back to History for Sleep. Tonight, we invite you to rest as we tell the complete story of a remarkable physician and philosopher, a man known to the East as Ibn Sina, and to the West as Avicenna. Close your eyes, and let us travel together back to the 10th century. Over 1,000 years ago, the world was a tapestry of brilliant light and profound darkness. In the West, the great empires of antiquity were a distant memory, their knowledge fragmented and preserved in isolated monasteries. But in the East, a vibrant civilization was experiencing its golden age. Along the bustling trade routes of the Silk Road, in cities that shimmered like jewels in the desert, human knowledge was not just being preserved. It was being reborn and expanded at a breathtaking pace. In this world of stark contrasts, a man was born whose mind would become a crucible for the wisdom of the past and a beacon for the future. In the lands of Persia, he was known as Abu Ali al-Husayn ibn Abdullah ibn Sina. To the scholars of a later Europe who would study his works with reverent awe, he would be known by a single immortal name, Avicenna. His story is not one of quiet contemplation, but of intellectual conquest. His life's purpose was to master and systematize the entirety of human knowledge, from the subtle rhythm of a patient's pulse to the fundamental nature of existence itself, from the correct mixture of herbs in a remedy to the intricate faculties of the human soul. His life was a profound paradox. He was a physician of unparalleled skill, yet his most challenging diagnoses were often of the spirit, not the flesh. He was a philosopher who sought eternal, unchanging truths, yet he lived a life of constant turmoil, navigating the treacherous world of court politics. He rose to the rank of vizier, the highest minister in government, only to be thrown into a dungeon as a political prisoner. He was a celebrated genius, sought after by kings and emirs, and a hunted fugitive, forced to flee for his life in disguise. It was amidst this chaos that he composed his masterpieces, often dictating entire chapters from his perfect memory to loyal students, working by candlelight after a long day of administering the affairs of state. He inherited the vast intellectual legacy of the ancient Greeks, the rigorous logic of Aristotle, the medical authority of Galen. But he was no mere scribe or compiler. He took this ancient knowledge, tested it against his own relentless logic and practical experience, and forged it into a new, comprehensive system. His medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, became the most authoritative medical text in the world for over 600 years. It was the bedrock of medical education not just in the Islamic world, but in the nascent universities of Europe, from Padua and Paris to Oxford, shaping the practice of medicine well into the modern era. His corresponding philosophical encyclopedia, aptly titled The Book of Healing, was even more ambitious. It was a prescription for the human mind itself, designed to cure the soul's most persistent ailment, ignorance. The story of Avicenna is the story of a mind that built an empire of reason. It is a testament to the power of intellectual discipline in a world of chaos. He stands as a monumental bridge in human history, a bridge connecting the wisdom of ancient Greece to the European Renaissance, a bridge between the flourishing Islamic East and the awakening Christian West. More profoundly, he built a bridge between faith and reason, and between the intricate mechanics of the human body and the limitless potential of the human soul. For 1,000 years, his name has been synonymous with wisdom, the name of a man who looked upon the universe and saw in its every detail a grand, magnificent, and logical design. The year is 980. The first millennium of the Common Era is drawing to a close, and humanity's intellectual fortunes are scattered and vastly unequal. In Europe, the memory of Rome is a ghost haunting a fractured landscape. Charlemagne's brief revival of a unified empire has faded, and the continent is a mosaic of feudal kingdoms, isolated communities, and competing powers. Knowledge is a flickering candle, carefully guarded within the stone walls of monasteries. Ancient texts are copied by hand, often imperfectly, onto expensive parchment. The great philosophical and scientific works of Greece are largely lost, existing only as fragmented references or third-hand summaries. The language of scholarship, Latin, is the domain of a tiny clerical elite. For the vast majority, life is local, agrarian, and disconnected from a wider world of ideas. The intellectual energy of the continent is dormant, waiting for a spark. Meanwhile, eastward, the pulse of civilization is strong, rapid, and vibrant. From the shores of the Atlantic in Al-Andalus, modern-day Spain, across North Africa, through Egypt, the Levant, and Persia, all the way to the frontiers of India and China, lies a vast, interconnected civilization. This is the Islamic world, and it is in the radiant heart of its golden age. While bound by a common faith, it is its shared thirst for knowledge that truly unites it. A single language, Arabic, serves as the universal medium for science, philosophy, and commerce, allowing an idea born in Cordoba to be debated in Baghdad and refined in Samarkand within a generation. This was a civilization not looking backward with nostalgia, but actively forging a new future on the foundations of all who had come before. This intellectual explosion was the result of a conscious, century-spanning project, centered initially in the magnificent city of Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. A century before Avicenna's birth, the caliphs, particularly Al-Ma'mun, had established an institution that would change the world: the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. This was no simple library. It was a state-funded research academy, a translation bureau, and a university rolled into one. The caliphs understood that true power lay not just in armies, but in knowledge. They initiated one of the most ambitious intellectual rescue missions in history: the Great Translation Movement. Emissaries were dispatched to the far corners of the known world, especially to the Byzantine Empire, the inheritor of Greek learning. They were tasked with acquiring any and all significant manuscripts they could find, paying for them, at times, their weight in gold. The goal was monumental: to translate the entire corpus of Greek, Persian, and Indian secular knowledge into Arabic. In the halls of the House of Wisdom, a multicultural and multi-faith collection of scholars worked side by side. Nestorian Christians, fluent in Syriac and Greek, Jewish scholars, and their Muslim colleagues collaborated in a shared quest for truth. Through their tireless efforts, the giants of antiquity were reborn in Arabic. The logical framework of Aristotle, the philosophical dialogues of Plato, the medical encyclopedias of Galen, the geometric proofs of Euclid, the astronomical model of Ptolemy, all of it was meticulously translated, studied, and commented upon. This wasn't passive reception. It was an active dialogue across centuries. The scholars of Baghdad didn't just copy Aristotle. They argued with him. They didn't just accept Galen. They tested his theories with their own observations. They took the numerical system from India, including the revolutionary concept of zero, and integrated it into their mathematics, creating the foundations of algebra. This intellectual fire was fueled by a simple, yet world-changing, technological innovation: paper. The secret of papermaking, learned from Chinese prisoners of war centuries earlier, had been perfected in cities like Samarkand. Unlike the cumbersome and expensive parchment used in Europe, paper was cheap, efficient to produce, and easy to write on. This paper revolution was the internet of its age. It democratized knowledge. For the first time in history, books could be produced in large quantities and at a cost that made them accessible beyond a tiny circle of the ultra-wealthy. Libraries, both public and private, swelled with tens, even hundreds of thousands of volumes, while the greatest library in Europe might hold a few hundred. This flood of accessible information created an environment of unprecedented intellectual ferment. It was a world saturated with inquiry, hungry for discovery, and equipped with the tools to achieve it. It was a civilization that had built the most fertile ground imaginable for a genius to grow. And it was on the eastern edge of this vibrant world, in the heart of Central Asia, that the stage was being set for the arrival of a mind that would master it all. In the late 10th century, the intellectual heart of this vibrant Islamic civilization beat strongest not in Baghdad, but further east, deep in Central Asia. Here lay the magnificent city of Bukhara, the capital of the Samanid Empire. It was known throughout the known world by a title of deep reverence, Qubat al-Islam, the Dome of Islam. This was not merely a title of religious significance. It signified that Bukhara was a sanctuary of learning, a pinnacle of culture, and a beacon of intellectual light. The environment within its walls was perhaps the most perfectly engineered ecosystem for nurturing a prodigious mind that the world had yet seen. The rulers of the Samanid dynasty were not typical conquerors or tyrants. They were enlightened Persian monarchs who consciously revived Persian culture and language while championing the Arabic language of science. Rulers like Nasser II invested immense fortunes into transforming Bukhara into a global center for the arts and sciences. They attracted the greatest scholars, poets, physicians, and architects of their time, offering them patronage, resources, and most importantly, intellectual freedom. The atmosphere in the city was electric with curiosity. In the courtyards of its grand mosques and the lecture halls of its madrasas, one could hear the constant murmur of debate. Discussions on astronomy, mathematics, alchemy, and philosophy were constant. The air was not thick with dogma, but with the thrill of discovery and the rigor of logical argument. To walk through the streets of Samanid Bukhara was to witness a civilization at its zenith. The architecture itself spoke of a confident and prosperous culture, with intricately tiled mosques and towering minarets. Caravans arrived daily from the far reaches of the Silk Road, a steady river of humanity and commerce. The city's sprawling bazaars were a sensory explosion, filled not only with the glistening silks from China, the sharp scent of spices from India, and the fine metalwork from Byzantium, but with something far more precious, ideas. A traveler from Egypt might describe new techniques in irrigation. A philosopher from Baghdad could bring with him the latest translations and commentaries on Greek texts. A mathematician from the Indian subcontinent might share his revolutionary concepts of the number zero, which the scholars of Bukhara would then use to advance algebra and astronomy. It was a crucible where the world's knowledge met, mingled, and was forged into something new and greater. You could hear dozens of languages spoken, but the language of high learning that connected them all was Arabic. The city's commitment to knowledge was institutional and deeply embedded. Its libraries were legendary, vast complexes housing hundreds of thousands of volumes, rivaling and perhaps even surpassing the great collections of Baghdad. These were not locked, dusty archives, but humming centers of scholarship where librarians were respected scholars in their own right. The Samanid Royal Library, in particular, was considered one of the wonders of the world, meticulously catalogued and organized by subject, containing rare manuscripts that existed nowhere else. Alongside the libraries were the hospitals, known as bimaristans. These were far more than simple infirmaries for the sick. They were highly organized medical centers, often secular in their operation and open to patients of all faiths. They had specialized wards for different ailments, their own pharmacies dispensing remedies, and most crucially, they functioned as the premier medical schools of the era. Here, aspiring physicians learned both theory from the great texts of Galen and practice at the bedside of the patient, a model of clinical education that was centuries ahead of its time. Meanwhile, in observatories equipped with sophisticated instruments like large sextants and astrolabes, astronomers mapped the stars with astonishing precision, correcting the calculations of the ancient Greek master, Ptolemy, and creating astronomical tables, or zij, of unparalleled accuracy. The intellectual culture actively encouraged rational debate, particularly through the discipline known as kalam. This was not casual conversation. It was the formal practice of using logical argumentation to explore theological and philosophical questions. This tradition created a citywide environment where reasoned argument and evidence were held in the highest esteem. Scholars were not punished for questioning old ideas. They were rewarded for proposing new, more elegant theories based on logic and observation. It was an ecosystem perfectly designed to nurture a genius. This was the city at the height of its glory that awaited the birth of one of humanity's most prodigious intellects. His arrival was not a historical accident. He was the product of a civilization that had consciously built a home for wisdom in the heart of the desert. The foundations of ancient knowledge had been laid, the resources had been gathered, and the intellectual climate was perfect. All that was missing was a master architect, a mind vast enough to take these materials and construct from them an entirely new edifice of human thought. Into this vibrant world of scholarship and commerce, in a small village named Avicenna in the vicinity of the great city of Bukhara, a child was born around the year 980. He was given the name Husain. He was not born into royalty, nor into a long line of famous scholars, but into the modest and respected home of a government official. His father, Abdullah, was a loyal servant of the Samanid Empire, working as a regional governor and tax collector. He was an educated, cultured man, but what truly set him apart and would ultimately shape the destiny of his son was his profound intellectual curiosity and an exceptionally open mind. This home, more than any school or library, would become the crucible in which the mind of a prodigy was forged. Abdullah was a follower of Ismailism, a branch of Shia Islam. To understand the young Avicenna, we must understand what this meant for the air he breathed as a child. Unlike more dogmatic interpretations of faith, the Ismaili intellectual tradition of that era was deeply engaged with philosophy, particularly the Neoplatonism that sought to synthesize Greek reason with spiritual revelation. They valued esoteric, allegorical interpretations of Scripture and believed that the pursuit of knowledge was a sacred duty. Consequently, the household of Abdullah was not a place of rigid rules and unquestionable authority. It was a sanctuary for rational inquiry, a space where vibrant intellectual debate was the norm. This was the single most important gift Abdullah gave his son, an environment where questioning was not a sin, but a virtue. Every evening, the family home in Avicenna transformed into a miniature academy. Abdullah had a passion for learning and would frequently invite traveling scholars, learned merchants, and itinerant thinkers who passed through the region to his home for dinner and discussion. We must imagine the young Husain, a small boy, sitting not with other children, but in a quiet corner of the main room. While his father and his guests engaged in spirited debates, the boy listened. He was a silent, intense observer. The conversations that filled his childhood home were not about local gossip or the price of goods. They were about the geometry of Euclid, the nature of the soul, and the fascinating new concepts of arithmetic arriving from India, including the perplexing and powerful idea of the number zero. He could not, of course, have understood the full depth of these adult discussions. But that was not the point. His mind, like a sponge, was absorbing something far more fundamental. He was learning the vocabulary of logic. He was internalizing the structure of a well-reasoned argument. He was witnessing firsthand the passion and joy that came from the pursuit of truth. While other children learned games, he learned the rhythm of intellectual inquiry. He saw that the universe was not a set of fixed answers to be memorized, but a collection of profound questions to be explored. His father and his brother would often discuss these matters, and the young Husain would listen, absorbing it all, his prodigious memory capturing not just words, but entire chains of reasoning. His father quickly recognized that his son's mind was extraordinary. He saw a focus, a capacity for memory, and a quickness of understanding that was far beyond his years. Instead of stifling this gift, Abdullah nurtured it. He provided Husain with the best tutors he could afford and encouraged his every question. One of the earliest accounts tells of Avicenna learning the principles of Indian calculation from a local greengrocer. This small fact speaks volumes. It shows a humility, instilled by his family, and a desire to learn from any available source, regardless of their social standing. Knowledge was knowledge, whether it came from a great scholar or a humble merchant. This early education was informal but incredibly potent. It was an apprenticeship in thinking itself, an upbringing that built the foundations of his intellect long before he ever opened the great books of medicine and philosophy that would later define his life. The child was being prepared in the quiet laboratory of his own home to one day take on the entire world of ideas. The primary tool that defined Avicenna's entire life, the engine that powered his intellectual conquests, was a memory of almost superhuman capacity. It is crucial to understand that this was not merely the ability to recall facts, as a lesser mind might. His was a structural, architectural memory. When he read a page, he did not simply take a mental photograph of the words. He absorbed the logical framework, the underlying architecture of the argument. He saw the connections, the premises, and the conclusions not as a list, but as an interconnected, three-dimensional structure. This allowed him to build, piece by piece, a vast and perfectly organized palace of knowledge within his own mind, a library to which he had instant and total access for the rest of his life. This profound ability manifested itself in astonishing ways from his earliest years. The most famous testament to his power of recall is his memorization of the entire Quran by the age of 10. While an impressive feat for any child, for Hussein it was more than an act of piety or memory. It was an exercise in deep linguistic and structural mastery. The classical Arabic of the Quran is immensely complex, with intricate grammar and nuanced layers of meaning. To memorize it was to internalize the very DNA of the language of scholarship he would one day command. It demonstrated a level of mental discipline and focus that was simply unheard of. But his mind was not a passive storage device. It was an active, voracious predator of knowledge. His curiosity was a fire that could not be quenched. It knew no boundaries between disciplines. For the young Hussein, the world was not divided into separate subjects like jurisprudence, poetry, mathematics, and theology. It was all one vast, interconnected tapestry of wisdom, and he wanted to master every single thread. He would move from studying Islamic law with a local scholar to debating the finer points of Persian poetry, to learning the practical applications of numbers from a merchant. His intellect was constantly probing, questioning, and seeking to understand the underlying principles of everything he encountered. He was driven by a relentless need to know why things were the way they were. This insatiable hunger for understanding would become the defining characteristic of his life's work. We must also consider the psychological reality of being such a child. Genius is often a lonely country. While other children were concerned with games and simple lessons, Hussein's mind was grappling with concepts that would challenge educated adults. There must have been a sense of profound isolation, of inhabiting an intellectual reality that few, if any, around him could fully share. He quickly surpassed the knowledge of his initial tutors, a situation that can be as frustrating for the student as it is for the teacher. He learned early on that if he wanted to find answers to his deepest questions, he would have to rely on his own intellect. This fostered a powerful sense of self-reliance and an unshakable confidence in the power of his own reason, traits that would be both a source of immense strength and, at times, perceived arrogance later in his life. Then, when Hussein was around the age of 10, a pivotal event occurred. His father, Abdullah, was reassigned from their quiet village to the bustling heart of the Samanid Empire, the metropolis of Bukhara itself. For a boy of his temperament and intellect, this move was like a caged eagle being released into the open sky. If his home had been a spark, Bukhara was a raging bonfire of knowledge. The abstract world of ideas he had heard about in his father's evening discussions was now a tangible reality. The great libraries he could only have imagined were now just a short walk away. The renowned scholars he had only heard of by name were now teaching in the city's madrasas. The boy who had already absorbed everything his small world could offer was now standing at the gates of the wisest city on earth. He was ready to test his mind against the collected wisdom of humanity, and Bukhara was ready for him. The period of quiet preparation was over. The conquest was about to begin. Once settled in Bukhara, the full explosive potential of Husayn's intellect was unleashed. The city was an ocean of knowledge, and he plunged into its depths with a ferocious determination. His father, Abdullah, recognizing the truly exceptional nature of his son's gift, spared no expense in hiring the best private tutors the great city had to offer. These were not ordinary teachers. They were esteemed scholars, masters of the disciplines that formed the core of a classical education. One such famous tutor was a man named Al-Natili, a philosopher who was brought in to formally instruct the boy. They began with the standard curriculum, an introduction to logic through Porphyry's isagogy, and the foundational geometric proofs of Euclid's elements. A strange and remarkable pattern quickly began to emerge, a dynamic that would define Husayn's entire educational experience. The relationship between student and master was inverted. Al-Natili would begin to explain a complex logical problem or a geometric proof, defining the initial terms and premises. But before he could proceed, he would find the boy's eyes light up with immediate comprehension. Often, before the teacher had even finished his careful step-by-step explanation, Husayn would not only grasp the entire concept but would see its further implications. He would then, with exquisite respect but with an irrefutable and crystalline logic, interject. He would point out a more elegant path to the solution, or identify a subtle flaw in the traditional line of reasoning presented in the textbooks. He didn't just solve the problems his tutor gave him. He solved the problem of the problem itself, making the teacher's explanation almost redundant. Imagine the scene: a seasoned, bearded scholar of Bukhara, respected throughout the city for his learning, being gently corrected on a point of logic by a boy barely in his teens. It was like a master shipbuilder trying to teach a boy who could already see the finished vessel in a block of wood. One by one, the finest tutors in the city found themselves in the same astonishing position. After a short period of instruction, they would come to Abdullah and humbly admit that they had nothing more to teach his son. The student had absorbed the entirety of their knowledge, processed it, and in many cases already surpassed it. The river of their learning had been drunk dry by this single thirsty mind. By the age of just 14 or 15, Avicenna, as history would know him, was left with no one to guide him. So he became his own master. He embarked on a program of self-education so systematic and so intense that it seems almost inconceivable. His method was not to dabble but to conquer. He would select a science and would not move on until he had completely mastered it, from its first principles to its most complex applications. He built his internal palace of knowledge with the rigor of an architect, ensuring every foundation was solid before the next layer was added. He began with logic, then moved through the entirety of mathematics and geometry. After that, he consumed the natural sciences, physics, biology, astronomy, and only then did he feel prepared to tackle the queen of all sciences, metaphysics. His discipline was made of iron. According to his own autobiography, written years later, he could not recall sleeping through a single entire night during this period. As the great city of Bukhara quieted down, the single light in his window would often be the only one still burning. He would study throughout the day, and when night fell, he would continue by the faint light of an oil lamp. When exhaustion threatened to overcome him, or when he wrestled with a problem so difficult that his mind could find no purchase, he developed his own methods for overcoming intellectual blocks. He would walk to the nearby mosque to pray, not necessarily for a divine answer, but for the mental clarity that came with quiet contemplation. At other times, he famously confessed, he would drink a single glass of wine, not for intoxication, but to re-energize his spirit and sharpen his weary thoughts. Then, invigorated, he would return to his books. He was not driven by duty or the command of a teacher, but by a pure, all-consuming passion. For him, the act of learning, of solving a puzzle and seeing a hidden truth revealed, was the greatest pleasure life could offer. After mastering the theoretical sciences, his formidable intellect began to seek a practical application. He turned his attention to medicine. In a statement that reveals his immense intellectual confidence, he would later write that medicine was not one of the difficult sciences, when compared to the absolute certainties of mathematics and metaphysics. For a mind trained in the unforgiving black and white world of pure logic, the empirical and often inexact nature of medicine seemed less of a challenge. He saw the human body not as an unknowable mystery subject to the whims of spirits, but as a complex yet rational system of causes and effects. It was a machine that could be understood, analyzed, and, when broken, repaired. He dove into the great medical texts of the ancients, the works of the Greek masters Hippocrates and Galen, which had been so carefully preserved and translated by the scholars of Baghdad. But true to his nature, he was not content with mere theory. Knowledge, for him, was useless unless it was applied and tested in the real world. He immediately began to practice the art of healing. He offered his services to the sick of Bukhara, often visiting the poor and needy in their homes, treating them for free. This was his laboratory. He was driven not by a desire for fame or money, but by his relentless curiosity and a genuine desire to alleviate suffering. For him, every patient was a new text to be read, a living mystery whose secrets could be unraveled through careful observation and logical deduction. He would note the color of the skin, the nature of the pulse, the patient's diet and emotional state, connecting dots that other more experienced physicians had missed. And as he began to succeed where others had failed, the whispers started. In the markets, in the tea houses, in the courtyards of the great city, a legend was being born. The story of the boy doctor whose diagnostic skill seemed less like science and more like magic. While the legend of the boy doctor grew in the streets of Bukhara, Avicenna was waging a second parallel campaign in the solitude of his study. His practice of medicine was, in a way, a secondary theater of operations. His primary war was a philosophical one, a relentless assault on the fortress of human knowledge itself. This was not a hobby, nor was it the casual pursuit of a cultured young man. For Avicenna, this campaign of self-education was the central purpose of his existence. His goal was not simply to learn, it was to achieve a state of absolute certainty, a concept known in Arabic philosophy as yaqin. He was not content with opinions, traditions, or the unexamined words of ancient masters. He sought to build, within his own mind, a complete and unshakable edifice of truth, where every single brick was tested and placed with the certainty of a mathematical proof. The chief weapon in his arsenal, the universal tool he used to dismantle and then reconstruct every field of knowledge, was the logic of Aristotle. For Avicenna, logic was not merely one subject among many. It was the master key. It was the fundamental operating system for the human mind, the set of rules that governed all correct thinking. He saw it as a form of intellectual hygiene, a method for cleansing the mind of fallacy, superstition, and imprecise thought. He mastered the syllogism, the art of deduction, the precise definition of terms, until these tools became as natural to him as breathing. He believed that any subject, no matter how complex, be it the motion of the planets, the functioning of the human body, or the nature of the soul, would ultimately yield its secrets if subjected to a sufficiently rigorous logical analysis. This unwavering faith in reason was the engine of his entire campaign. With his tools sharpened, he approached the body of knowledge not randomly, but with the grand strategy of a general. He envisioned the sciences in a strict hierarchy, a great pyramid that had to be built from the ground up. To attempt to understand the highest truths without first mastering the foundational ones was, in his view, an act of intellectual folly. The base of his pyramid was logic itself, the toolmaker's shop. Once the tools were perfected, he moved to the first layer of construction: mathematics and geometry. Here, in the world of numbers and forms, he found the beauty of absolute certainty. The truths of geometry were perfect, eternal, and irrefutable. Mastering Euclid gave his mind a taste for the kind of rigorous axiomatic proof he sought in all other fields. The next layer was the vast and complex world of the natural sciences. This included physics, the study of motion, change, and the elements that made up the material world. It included biology, the study of what he called the vegetative and animal souls, the principles that govern the growth of plants and the senses of animals. It included astronomy, the study of the celestial spheres, which he saw as a perfect divine mechanism. He consumed the works of the ancients on these subjects, but never as a passive student. He was always an interrogator, cross-examining the text with his logic, comparing its claims to his own observations of the world. He was building a coherent picture of the entire physical universe, from the smallest grain of sand to the most distant star. Only after he felt he had mastered the entirety of the material world did he permit himself to ascend to the pyramid's final, ultimate level, the capstone of metaphysics. For Avicenna, as for Aristotle before him, this was the first philosophy, the science of being itself. This was the most profound and most difficult of all disciplines. It did not ask how the world works, but why it exists at all. It asked, what is existence? What is reality? What is the relationship between the temporary, changing world we see and the eternal, unchanging principles that must lie behind it? And ultimately, it led to the highest question of all, the nature of the first cause, the unmoved mover, the necessary existent, the philosophical definition of God. This entire systematic campaign was, for him, a spiritual and intellectual pilgrimage. Each level of science brought him closer to understanding the ultimate reality and the divine source from which all knowledge and existence flowed. With his prodigious mind and relentless work ethic, he moved through this hierarchy with astonishing speed. Logic, mathematics, physics, astronomy. All of these vast fields yielded to his intellectual assault. He saw their inner workings, mastered their principles, and stored their entire structures within his mental palace. He was achieving his goal of total comprehension. Every fortress he laid siege to fell. Every door he knocked on opened. Every puzzle he confronted he solved. All except one. At the very pinnacle of his quest, at the final capstone of the pyramid, he hit a wall of thought so dense and so abstract that even his brilliant mind could not seem to penetrate it. The wall he struck, the intellectual fortress that resisted his every assault, was a single book. But it was the single most important book in the entire philosophical tradition he sought to master. It was the Metaphysics of Aristotle. To understand the depth of Avicenna's struggle, one must first understand the colossal stature of Aristotle in the Islamic Golden Age. He was not seen as just one philosopher among many. He was revered with a title of ultimate authority, the first teacher. His system of logic was considered the final word on the rules of human reason. His works on physics, biology, and ethics formed the very foundation of the scientific curriculum. To be a philosopher in the 10th century meant, first and foremost, to be a student of Aristotle. And to be a master, one had to master his most profound and difficult work. The Metaphysics is not a book one simply reads. It is a summit one attempts to climb. It is not a cleanly written textbook. It is widely believed to be a collection of Aristotle's own lecture notes, compiled over many years. The text is dense, the language is compressed, and the subject matter is the most abstract conceivable to the human mind. It does not ask about this or that type of being, but about being as such. It explores the nature of substance, the meaning of essence, the first principles of reality, and the ultimate cause of all motion and existence. The arguments are complex, often circling back on themselves, and the overall structure can seem bewildering to even the most brilliant reader. For Avicenna, who craved logical order and systematic clarity above all else, the book must have felt like a labyrinth. This text became his obsession. He, who had devoured entire sciences with ease, now focused the full power of his intellect on this single volume. He read it once, twice, 10 times. He applied the full force of his logical toolkit, trying to dissect its arguments and map its structure. But its ultimate purpose remained shrouded in fog. According to his own account in his autobiography, he read the Metaphysics of Aristotle a staggering 40 times. He read it until he had committed every single word, every sentence, every convoluted argument to his prodigious memory. He knew the text by heart, forwards and backwards. He could have recited the entire book from memory without a single error. And yet, he did not understand it. This was a new and terrifying experience for him. For the first time in his life, his mind had failed him. His memory could capture the body of the text, but his reason could not grasp its soul. He had all the individual pieces of a magnificent, impossibly complex machine, but he had no blueprint. He could see all the intricate gears and levers, but he could not comprehend how they fit together or what the machine was designed to do. He understood the individual arguments, but the grand project, the ultimate goal of the first teacher, remained a complete mystery. It was as if he had memorized every single note of a divine symphony but was deaf to the music itself. This failure plunged him into a state of profound intellectual frustration, bordering on despair. He had built his entire identity on the belief that any problem could be solved through sufficient application of reason. But here was a problem that resisted him completely. The wall stood unbreached. He began to doubt himself, to question the very limits of his own intellect. He, who had surpassed every teacher and mastered every other science, was now utterly defeated by a book written over 1,000 years earlier. The capstone of his great pyramid of knowledge refused to be set in place. Finally, exhausted and disheartened, he gave up. He concluded that the book was simply beyond his, or perhaps any, human comprehension. He put the text aside, admitting his first and only intellectual defeat. The conqueror of knowledge had finally been conquered. With the door to metaphysics seemingly locked forever, a dejected Avicenna turned his focus elsewhere, pouring his energies into the more straightforward sciences and his growing medical practice. Yet, the sting of that single intellectual defeat lingered. The unconquered summit of Aristotle's thought remained a shadow in the back of his mind. Then, one afternoon, an event occurred that was so improbable, so perfectly timed, it seemed like an intervention of fate itself. The solution to his greatest intellectual problem did not come from a grand library or a famous master, but from a dusty corner of the city's marketplace. He was wandering aimlessly through the bookseller's quarter of Bukhara, his mind likely preoccupied. A persistent broker approached him, holding out a small, unassuming volume. The broker was auctioning it, but Avicenna, glancing at it with disinterest, dismissed it out of hand. He believed it to be useless, another commentary that would shed no new light on the subjects he had already mastered. He refused the offer and began to walk away. But the seller was insistent. "The owner is in great need of the money," he pressed. "It is very cheap, I will sell it to you for 3 dirhams. Avicenna was still convinced the book was worthless, but he was moved by the seller's plea. Out of a simple act of charity, a moment of pity for the book's unseen, desperate owner, he paid the paltry sum and took the little book, expecting nothing from it. He returned home, perhaps annoyed at having spent even a small amount on something he didn't want. Casually, he began to examine his purchase. He saw that it was a brief commentary, just a short treatise on the subject of Aristotle's metaphysics, and it was written by a philosopher whose name carried immense weight, Abu Nasr al-Farabi. To understand the jolt that must have gone through Avicenna, one must understand Al-Farabi's reputation. If Aristotle was the first teacher, Al-Farabi, who had lived a century before Avicenna, was universally acclaimed as the second teacher. He was considered the greatest philosophical mind in the Islamic world since the translation movement began. He was the master interpreter of Aristotle, a man renowned for his ability to take the dense and difficult texts of the Greeks and explain them with unparalleled clarity and insight. Avicenna had, of course, studied Al-Farabi's works on logic and political science, but he had never encountered this particular commentary. With a flicker of renewed hope, he began to read. And then the miracle happened. As his eyes moved across the pages, the dense fog that had shrouded Aristotle's work for so long began to part. Al-Farabi's lucid prose acted as a key, sliding perfectly into the lock that had resisted all of Avicenna's forceful attempts. The explanations were so clear, so concise, so perfectly aimed at the book's most difficult passages, that they acted as a sudden, brilliant beam of light, illuminating the entire labyrinthine structure of Aristotle's thought. In that moment, the 40 agonizing, fruitless readings were redeemed. Every memorized word, every obscure phrase, every convoluted argument that had been stored in his mind as a meaningless jumble suddenly snapped into its correct place. He could finally see the blueprint. He could understand the grand architecture of the project. The machine whose parts he had known so intimately was now fully assembled in his mind, its function and purpose revealed in all its majestic glory. The symphony whose individual notes he had memorized was now playing in his soul, a thunderous and beautiful chorus of pure reason. He had not just understood the book, he had conquered it. The wall had crumbled. The feeling that washed over him was not one of proud accomplishment, but of immense, overwhelming joy and gratitude. The intellectual darkness he had been living in was gone, and the light was almost blinding. In his autobiography, he describes his reaction. It was so profound, so deeply felt, that he did not simply sit and savor his victory. He immediately rose, went to the great mosque of Bukhara, and distributed a large sum of money to the city's poor. It was an act of thanksgiving to God, an acknowledgement that this breakthrough was not just the product of his own stubborn effort, but a gift of grace, delivered to him in the form of a cheap, second-hand book he had bought out of pity. This experience taught Avicenna a lesson far more profound than any found in the metaphysics itself. It was a lesson in intellectual humility. He, the great prodigy who had surpassed all his teachers, learned that even the most powerful mind cannot know everything on its own. It taught him that knowledge is not a solitary conquest, but a great intergenerational conversation. Each thinker stands on the shoulders of those who came before. Al-Farabi had built a bridge that allowed Avicenna to cross the chasm that had separated him from Aristotle. With the capstone of his pyramid now firmly in place, his mind was finally equipped with the most powerful analytical tools ever devised. And very soon, he would have the opportunity to apply this philosophical rigor to the most human of all sciences, the art of healing. With the philosophical capstone of Aristotle's metaphysics now firmly in place, Avicenna possessed a mind of unparalleled analytical power. He continued his medical work in Bukhara, but now with a new level of insight. He saw the practice of healing not just as a collection of remedies for symptoms, but as a holistic science, one that required the same logical rigor as a philosophical proof. For him, a sick body was a complex syllogism where one of the premises was wrong, and the physician's job was to find that flawed premise through careful observation and deduction. His local successes, particularly with difficult cases that had baffled other practitioners, continued to build his reputation. The whispers about the boy doctor grew louder, no longer confined to the city's markets but beginning to reach the ears of those in power. Soon, this growing fame would be put to the ultimate test. A crisis was unfolding within the opulent walls of the Samanid palace. The sovereign of the empire, the Emir Ibn Mansur, lay gravely ill. A mysterious and debilitating malady had taken hold of him, a disease that resisted every known treatment. This was more than a personal tragedy. It was a political emergency. The health of the emir was directly tied to the stability of the state. As his condition worsened, a shadow of uncertainty and fear fell over the entire court, and by extension the empire. The most eminent physicians of the realm were summoned to the royal bedside. These were not local healers. They were the best medical minds in Central Asia, men of immense experience and prestige, with gray beards that spoke of decades of practice. They descended upon the palace with their books of remedies and their intricate theories based on the works of Galen. They worked frantically, day and night, trying every treatment in their arsenal. They prescribed complex herbal potions, meticulously prepared according to ancient formulas. They performed bloodletting, the standard practice for nearly every ailment, intended to rebalance the body's supposed humors. They consulted astrological charts and offered prayers. But nothing worked. The emir's strength continued to fade. The fevers did not break. The profound sickness that gripped him only tightened its hold. With each passing day, the mood in the court grew more desperate. The great physicians, their authority crumbling with every failed attempt, were forced to admit their impotence. They were confronted with a disease that lay outside the bounds of their collective knowledge. It was in this atmosphere of failure and rising panic that a courtier made a desperate, almost unthinkable suggestion. He had heard the stories circulating in the city, the rumors of a young man, barely 17 or 18 years of age, who possessed a diagnostic ability that seemed almost supernatural. In a council of worried advisors, he put forth the name, Hussein ibn Abdullah, the son of the local governor. The proposal was likely met with a wave of skepticism and scorn, especially from the assembled royal physicians. It would have been a profound insult to their profession. How could a boy, a teenager with no formal titles and a handful of years of experience, possibly succeed where they, the masters of their craft, had failed so completely? It seemed preposterous, a grasp at straws in a hopeless situation. They likely dismissed him as a charlatan, a clever youth whose reputation was built on a few lucky cures of common ailments. But desperation is a powerful motivator. For the Emir ibn Mansur, lying in his sickbed, the arguments of his proud physicians meant little. He was facing his own mortality. The traditional methods had failed, and the guardians of that tradition had no more answers. When every conventional path leads to a dead end, even an unlikely trail seems worth exploring. He was willing to try anything. And so the emir gave his consent. A royal summons was dispatched. Imagine the scene as the imperial guards arrived at Avicenna's modest home. The summons was not an invitation. It was a command, laden with both immense opportunity and mortal peril. To succeed would be to earn the eternal gratitude of the most powerful man in the land. To fail, or to be seen as a fraud, could very well mean disgrace, exile, or even death. Avicenna, calm and composed, accepted the summons. He walked through the gates of the grand palace, a tall, slender youth with the intense eyes of a scholar, stepping into the heart of power and intrigue. He was led through opulent halls, past anxious courtiers and armed guards, into the royal bedchamber. There, the air was thick with the scent of incense and medicinal herbs, and with a palpable sense of despair. On one side of the room stood the cohort of court physicians, old, proud, and suspicious, observing his every move with hostile eyes. On the bed lay the emir, a man reduced to a shadow by his illness. The entire weight of the Samanid court, and perhaps the future of the empire itself, now rested on the shoulders of this young man. He approached the royal bed, his mind, honed by the logic of Aristotle and the wisdom of Al-Farabi, ready to confront the ultimate puzzle. Avicenna approached the royal bed, moving with a calm deliberation that stood in stark contrast to the frantic, failed energy of the senior physicians. He gave a respectful nod to the ailing emir, his eyes already engaged in the first and most crucial phase of his method, intense, methodical observation. The other doctors saw a dying patient. Avicenna saw a complex problem, a living system that was out of balance, and his mind immediately began to search for the root cause. He did not immediately consult books of recipes or begin reciting prayers. Instead, he brought the full force of his philosophical training to bear on this medical puzzle. He was there to treat a man, not a collection of symptoms, and that meant understanding the entire context of the illness. He began his examination. He noted the color of the emir's skin, the texture of his tongue, the look in his eyes. He asked quiet, precise questions, not only about physical pains and discomforts, but about his diet, his habits, and his daily routines. While the court physicians had focused solely on the physical manifestations of the disease, Avicenna's inquiry was holistic. He was searching for any deviation from the norm, any clue, however small, that might have been overlooked. His approach was that of a detective investigating a crime scene. Then he moved to the central pillar of his diagnostic art, the analysis of the pulse. In Avicenna's hands, sphygmology, the study of the pulse, was not a simple counting of heartbeats. It was a high art, a form of communication with the body's inner workings. He believed the pulse was a river that carried information from every organ and every corner of the spirit. A master physician could read its subtle variations, its strength, its speed, its rhythm, its consistency, like a language. He took the emir's wrist, his fingers resting gently on the artery. He closed his eyes for a moment, concentrating, filtering out the anxious energy of the room and focusing solely on the thrum of life beneath his fingertips. The court physicians watched, their faces a mixture of scorn and curiosity. To them, this was basic procedure, but they soon witnessed it being elevated to a level they had never imagined. After a long moment of silent concentration, Avicenna spoke. His voice was clear and steady. He asked a courtier, a man known for his knowledge of the city, to stand near and begin reciting, slowly and clearly, the names of the different districts and boroughs of Bukhara. The courtier began the list. Avicenna's focus remained entirely on the pulse. One name, then another, then another. The pulse remained largely unchanged. But then, as the courtier spoke the name of a particular district, Avicenna detected it. A subtle flutter, an erratic leap in the rhythm, a momentary turbulence in the river. It was almost imperceptible, a clue that any other physician would have missed. He gave no outward sign, but he had found his first critical piece of evidence. He then instructed the courtier to narrow his focus. "Now," he said, "recite the names of the streets, the households, and the palaces within that specific district." The list began again, a litany of family names and local landmarks. Again, Avicenna's attention was absolute. A name was spoken, and again the pulse jumped, this time more noticeably. He was closing in. He had followed the thread from a district to a single household. Finally, he issued his last instruction. Recite the names of the people who live and work in that house. The courtier began to list the members of the family and their servants. A name was spoken. And in that instant, the emir's pulse surged violently under Avicenna's fingers, a frantic, chaotic leap that told him everything he needed to know. The secret was revealed. Avicenna gently released the emir's wrist and stepped back from the bed. The examination was over. A tense silence filled the room. The courtiers and physicians stared at him, awaiting his verdict. They expected to hear the name of a rare disease, a prescription for an exotic herb, or perhaps an admission of defeat like all the others. What they heard instead was a diagnosis that shattered their entire understanding of medicine. He declared that the emir's grave illness was not primarily of the body. There was no poison, no incurable infection, no fundamental imbalance of the humors that could be drained by bloodletting. The root cause of this near-fatal physical condition, he explained, was a malady of the soul. The emir was suffering from a profound and hidden emotional affliction. It was a severe case of lovesickness, a deep and unresolved passion for the person whose name had caused his heart to betray his secret. The court was stunned into silence. This was a radical, almost heretical idea. In an era that saw disease as the work of spirits or purely mechanical failures of the body, Avicenna had diagnosed a broken heart as if it were a fractured limb. He was proposing a direct causal link between a powerful, hidden emotion and a catastrophic physical collapse. He was, in essence, describing a psychosomatic illness, a concept the Western world would not begin to formally grasp for almost 1,000 years. To the old physicians, it must have sounded like poetry or madness, not medicine. But Avicenna stood with the unshakable confidence of a man who had followed a logical proof to its only possible conclusion. His entire future, his reputation, and possibly his life, now depended on whether the court would believe in this unbelievable diagnosis. The diagnosis hung in the air of the royal chamber, thick with disbelief. Avicenna's pronouncement that the emir was dying not from a physical disease, but from a broken heart, was met with outrage from the assembled court physicians. To them, it was an absurdity and insult to their rational Galenic tradition. They likely muttered protests, dismissing the boy's methods as parlor tricks, not medicine. They had spent weeks analyzing the emir's physical humors, his diet, and the positions of the stars, while this teenager had simply held his pulse and listened to a list of names. To them, his conclusion was unscientific, a flight of poetic fancy that had no place in the serious art of healing. The court's advisors were bewildered, caught between the total failure of their established experts and the bizarre, unproven theory of a youth. In the face of this wall of skepticism, Avicenna remained perfectly composed. He had followed the evidence to its logical conclusion, and he had absolute confidence in his findings. The emir, Na ibn Mansur, weak but still lucid, listened intently. He had felt the truth of it in his own heart when his pulse betrayed him. He had nothing to lose. The old ways had brought him to the edge of the grave. He looked at the confident young man before him and made a fateful decision. He would place his life in Avicenna's hands. He gave the order that the boy's instructions were to be followed to the letter. Avicenna then outlined his prescription, and it was as unconventional as his diagnosis. There would be no more bloodletting to weaken the already frail emir. There would be no harsh purgatives or complex, foul-tasting potions. The primary treatment, he insisted, was to address the root cause of the emotional turmoil. The medicine was to resolve the source of the lovesickness, to bring harmony to the emir's spirit by facilitating a union with the object of his affection. This was a matter for the court and the family to arrange, a diplomatic and personal cure rather than a medical one. Alongside this primary psychological intervention, Avicenna prescribed a gentle and supportive physical regimen. His goal was not to attack the disease, but to nurture the body's own healing capacities, which had been ravaged by the prolonged emotional stress. He designed a specific diet of light, easily digestible, and nourishing foods to restore the emir's strength. He prescribed calming herbal infusions, made from plants known to soothe the nerves and promote restful sleep. He recommended pleasant distractions, soft music, and reassuring company to lift the profound melancholy that had settled upon the emir's spirit. In essence, he was treating the entire human being, body, mind, and soul, as a single interconnected system. He was creating an environment for healing, allowing the body to recover once the crushing weight on the spirit had been lifted. The court followed his instructions, albeit with trepidation. The old physicians watched from the sidelines, waiting for this foolish experiment to fail. The entire court held its breath. The fate of the emir, and the life of the young doctor, hung in a delicate balance. The first few days were tense. But then, the first signs of a change began to appear. The recovery was slow at first, but it was undeniable. The emir's persistent fevers began to lessen. A hint of healthy color returned to his pale face. He began to take more food, and his sleep became deeper and less troubled. The profound sadness in his eyes started to be replaced by a glimmer of his former vitality. As the weeks went on, the improvement accelerated. The strength returned to his limbs. He was able to sit up, then to stand, and then to walk. The physical symptoms, which had been so severe and so resistant to every other treatment, seemed to melt away as his emotional state healed. The court watched in astonishment. The miracle they were witnessing was not the result of magic or divine intervention. It was the result of a brilliant deductive mind applying a holistic understanding of human health. Avicenna had been right. He had proven that the wounds of the spirit could inflict mortal wounds upon the body, and that healing the soul was the key to healing the flesh. When Amir na Ibn Mansur was fully recovered, restored to his full health and vigor, his gratitude toward the young man who had saved him was immeasurable. The atmosphere in the palace had transformed. The scorn of the old physicians had turned to a mixture of bitter envy and grudging awe. They had been humbled, their lifetimes of experience undone by the insight of a teenager. Avicenna was no longer just a curiosity, the boy doctor from the city. He was now hailed as a master, a physician of unparalleled genius. The emir summoned Avicenna to the throne room, not as a mere subject, but as a hero and a savior of the state. He stood before the entire court, a place where just weeks earlier he had been an object of suspicion, and the emir offered him the kind of rewards most men only dream of. He was offered gold, jewels, fine horses, and estates. He was offered a position of high honor and power in the government. For anyone else, this would have been the culmination of a life's ambition. But Avicenna's ambitions were of a different kind. His hunger was not for wealth or for power, but for the one treasure he valued above all others. Before the assembled court, facing the grateful emir who had offered him a fortune, the young Avicenna made a choice that would define the rest of his life and cement his legacy. With a calm and a maturity that seemed impossible for his 17 years, he gave a respectful bow and politely declined the offers of gold, land, and political power. He told the emir that the pleasure of having served him, and the successful application of his science, were reward enough. This act of humility and focus stunned the court. In a world driven by wealth and influence, this young man's currency was entirely different. However, he continued, there was one favor he would dare to ask. There was one treasure in the empire that he coveted above all others, a prize far more valuable to him than anything in the royal treasury. His request was, for many in the court, incomprehensible. He did not ask for a title or a personal fortune. He asked for permission to be granted access to, and the right to study in, the royal library of the Samanids. This was no ordinary library. This was one of the greatest repositories of knowledge in the world. Its fame was legendary, stretching the length of the Silk Road, a collection said to rival or even surpass the great libraries of Baghdad. It was the intellectual heart and brain of the Samanid Empire, a sanctuary of learning to which only a handful of the most trusted and elite scholars were ever given access. To grant the key of this kingdom of knowledge to a teenager was an act of unprecedented faith, a testament to the emir's immense gratitude and his awe at the boy's intellect. Impressed and perhaps even moved by the purity of the request, the emir granted it immediately and without reservation. The first time Avicenna walked through the doors of that library must have felt like entering paradise. Imagine endless halls and corridors, lined with towering shelves of intricately carved wood that rose to meet high vaulted ceilings. Imagine hundreds of thousands of volumes, each one a gateway to another mind, another world. The air itself smelled of old paper, of leather bindings, and of the silent, infinite promise of knowledge. The collection was meticulously organized into different rooms, each dedicated to a specific science. There was a hall for medicine, another for astronomy, another for philosophy, for poetry, for history, for alchemy. Here were the complete works of Aristotle and Plato, not in the flawed copies he may have encountered before, but in the finest translations available. Here were the foundational medical treatises of Hippocrates and Galen, side by side with the commentaries and editions of the great Persian and Indian physicians. He found rare manuscripts he did not even know existed, texts on subjects he had only heard whispers of. For Avicenna, this was a universe contained within a single building. Gold is spent, power is fleeting, but knowledge, once acquired, becomes a part of the soul, an eternal possession. He did not approach this ocean of knowledge as a casual reader. He dove into it with the same systematic ferocity he applied to everything else. He practically lived in the library, spending his days and a great portion of his nights within its hallowed walls. The librarians, themselves learned men, watched in amazement at the sheer speed with which he could read and the depth of his comprehension. He did not jump randomly from book to book. His systematic mind addressed each section methodically, devouring, comparing, analyzing, and most importantly, synthesizing the information. This was the crucial next step in his intellectual evolution. Until now, he had been a supreme absorber of knowledge. Here, in the great library, he began the process of becoming a true creator. With access to the totality of human learning, he began to see the hidden connections, the secret threads that wove all the disparate disciplines together. He saw how the logic of the Greek philosophers provided the structure for understanding the medicine of the Persian physicians. He saw how the mathematics of the Indians provided the language for describing the astronomy of the Alexandrians. He was no longer just learning what individual thinkers had said. He was placing them in a grand dialogue with one another inside his own mind. It was here, in the quiet, focused silence of the library, that the great seeds of his own masterpieces were planted and began to germinate. The foundational ideas for his revolutionary Canon of Medicine and his encyclopedic Book of Healing were born in these rooms. He had entered the library as a genius who knew everything that could be taught. He would emerge from it as a true authority, a master who was now ready to build his own universe of knowledge upon the unshakable foundations he now completely commanded. The era of peaceful, state-supported study in the great library of Bukhara was not destined to last. As the 10th century gave way to the 11th, the political landscape of Central Asia was violently reshaped. The Samanid Empire, the enlightened patrons who had fostered the region's Golden Age, began to crumble under the relentless pressure of invading Turkic tribes from the steppes. The world that had nurtured Avicenna was consumed by chaos and war. Bukhara was sacked, and the legendary library, that paradise of books where he had synthesized the knowledge of the world, was likely looted, its contents scattered or tragically burned. Avicenna lost everything: his home, his protectors, and most painfully, his access to the physical repositories of knowledge. This upheaval forced him into the life of a wanderer. For much of his adult life, he would be an itinerant scholar-physician, moving from one city to another, from one royal court to the next, in a constant search for a new patron who could provide the stability and resources necessary for his work. Yet, there was one library that no conqueror could take from him: the perfectly organized library he had built within his own mind. His years of systematic study and his prodigious memory meant that he carried the essence of those hundreds of thousands of volumes with him. It was during these years of instability and exile, often writing in precarious conditions, dictating to his loyal students in military tents or composing chapters in roadside inns, that he began to construct the work that would make him immortal. This was the Al-Qanun fi al-Tibb, known to the West as the Canon of Medicine. The title itself was a statement of breathtaking ambition. A canon is not a mere textbook. It is a law, a rule, a definitive and universal standard. Avicenna set out to do for the entire science of medicine what Euclid had done for geometry: to give it a complete, logical, and unshakable system, an ultimate structure that would encompass all existing knowledge in a rational and orderly fashion. He sought to transform the art of healing from a messy and often contradictory collection of ancient theories, practical experience, and folk superstition into a true and noble science. The Canon is a colossal work, organized into 5 great books. The first book alone constituted a profound revolution in medical thought. While nearly every medical text of the era began directly with a list of diseases and their supposed remedies, Avicenna took a radical step back. Before asking the question of how to cure sickness, he insisted on first asking a more fundamental question: what is health, and how is it maintained? He began his magnum opus by defining the very nature of medicine. He described it as the science by which we learn the various states of the human body in health and in sickness, and the means by which health may be preserved and, when it is lost, restored. This definition was groundbreaking. For the first time, the preservation of health was placed on the same level of importance as the curing of disease, if not higher. This was the conceptual birth of what we now call preventive medicine. In Avicenna's view, a physician's most important work should not begin when a person is already ill, but in the daily life of a healthy individual, guiding them on how to maintain the delicate balance of their body. To structure this new science of health, he used the rigorous logic of his master Aristotle. He synthesized the knowledge of Galen on anatomy and physiology but organized it with far greater clarity. He then identified 6 essential factors that, when kept in proper balance, were the causes of health, and when imbalanced, were the causes of disease. These were not demons or divine punishments. They were 6 logical, observable, and controllable aspects of daily life. First was the quality of the air and the environment. He wrote about the importance of clean, fresh air and choosing a place to live with a healthy climate, free from swamps and pollution. Second was food and drink. He dedicated entire chapters to diet, analyzing which foods were best in which seasons and for which types of constitution. Third was movement and repose. He stressed the necessity of balanced physical exercise to keep the body strong and the humors circulating, but also the importance of adequate rest. Fourth was sleep and wakefulness, analyzing the critical role of restorative sleep in allowing the body to heal and recharge. Fifth was evacuation and retention, the body's crucial need to efficiently eliminate waste products to avoid the buildup of toxins. And sixth, and perhaps most revolutionary, were the passions of the soul, our emotions. Building upon the insight he had gained when treating the emir, he systematically analyzed how emotions like anger, joy, fear, and grief could directly and physically impact the body. He described how rage could heat the body and accelerate the pulse, how deep sadness could chill the body and slow its functions. He argued that prolonged emotional states could directly predispose a person to specific physical illnesses. This was not a vague philosophical idea. It was a core principle of his medical system, a foundational link between the mind and the body. This first book of the Canon was a complete manual for a healthy and balanced life. It transformed medicine from a reactive craft, a desperate fight against existing diseases, into a proactive and noble science of human flourishing. It provided medicine with a solid philosophical foundation, elevating it to the highest rank of human knowledge. This architecture of health was merely the ground floor. Upon this foundation, Avicenna would proceed to build the rest of his monumental encyclopedia, detailing every known disease, every known remedy, and every known treatment imaginable. Having established the foundational principles of maintaining health in his first book, Avicenna next turned his systematic mind to the physician's arsenal, the vast array of substances used to restore health once it was lost. This led to the monumental second book of the Canon, a work that was, in essence, the first truly scientific pharmacopoeia in history. Before Avicenna, knowledge of remedies was a chaotic and unreliable landscape. It was a mixture of passed-down herbal traditions, folklore, anecdotal evidence, and recipes that were often contradictory and steeped in superstition. There was no consistent method for understanding how a drug worked, let alone for rigorously testing the efficacy of a new one. Avicenna looked upon this chaos and sought to impose upon it the same logical order he had applied to philosophy and the principles of health. The second book is a vast and meticulously organized catalogue of what he called the simples. These were the materia medica, the raw medicinal substances in their pure, unmixed forms. He systematically described approximately 800 of these substances, drawn from all three kingdoms of nature. The vegetable kingdom, with its vast array of herbs, roots, and flowers. The animal kingdom, from which substances like honey and crushed beetles were derived. And the mineral kingdom, which included clays, stones, and metallic compounds. For each of the 800 entries, from the most common garden herb to the rarest mineral, he provided a clear, structured analysis, a template of inquiry that was unprecedented in its rigor. First, he listed the substance's name and any known synonyms, creating a clear system of nomenclature. Next, he described what he called its nature or temperament, according to the prevailing theory of the four humors. But unlike his predecessors, he didn't simply label a plant hot or cold. He developed a sophisticated system of degrees, describing a substance as being, for example, hot in the second degree and dry in the first, lending a new level of nuance to the old theory. But the most revolutionary part of his analysis was his description of the drug's virtue, or its specific pharmacological action on the human body. He wasn't content to say that a certain root cured headaches. He sought to define its precise function. He described its action as an analgesic, a diuretic, a laxative, an anti-inflammatory, or a sedative. Furthermore, his practical experience as a physician shone through, as he offered clear instructions on how to select the highest quality samples of a substance and, crucially, how to detect common adulterations and forgeries. A vital skill for any working doctor. This vast encyclopedia of remedies would have been a monumental achievement in itself, but the true genius of the second book, the part that was arguably 1,000 years ahead of its time, was a short chapter in which he laid out a set of clear rules for experimenting with and testing new drugs. In this section, Avicenna established the fundamental principles of what we would today call a clinical trial. He argued that for any new drug to be accepted into the physician's toolkit, its efficacy must be demonstrated by following 7 strict conditions. First, he stated, the drug must be pure and free from any external acquired quality. The experiment must be clean. Second, the drug must be tested on a simple, not a complex disease. If a patient is suffering from multiple ailments, it would be impossible to know which one the drug was actually affecting. The variable had to be isolated. Third, the drug must be tested in at least 2 contrary types of disease. For instance, its effect on a hot disease and a cold disease must be observed, to determine if its action is universal or specific. Fourth, the power of the drug must be in proportion to the severity of the disease. This is the fundamental principle of dosage. Fifth, the time of its action must be observed, so that its effect is not confused with the body's natural healing process. Sixth, its effect must be seen to be constant, occurring in many cases. A one-time, accidental cure was not sufficient proof. The results had to be reproducible. And seventh, and most importantly, he insisted that the experiment must be conducted on a human body. He astutely observed that a medicine which cures a lion or a horse of a certain ailment might have a completely different, or even harmful, effect on a human. The final proof of a drug's worth could only come from human trials. These 7 rules, laid out with perfect clarity in the heart of the 11th century, are the unmistakable embryo of modern evidence-based medicine. In an age of authority and tradition, Avicenna was demanding experimentation, reproducibility, and rigorous evidence-based proof. With the principles of health established in the first book, and the physician's arsenal of remedies now catalogued and subjected to scientific scrutiny in the second, Avicenna had prepared the ground. He was now ready to map the battlefield itself, the human body and the hundreds of particular diseases that could afflict it from head to toe. With the principles of health established and the physician's arsenal of remedies scientifically catalogued, Avicenna was now prepared to address the vast and complex landscape of human sickness itself. This brings us to the third, and by far the largest, book of the Canon of Medicine. If the first book was the philosophical foundation and the second was the armory, The third book was the detailed map of the battlefield. It was a complete and comprehensive encyclopedia of particular diseases, and it would become the most consulted and influential clinical manual in the world for the next 600 years. Its genius lay not only in the depth of its content but in its brilliant, intuitive, and profoundly practical organization. Avicenna structured the third book anatomically, following a system known as a capite ad calcem, literally, from the head to the heel. He began at the top of the body and worked his way down organ by organ, system by system. This simple but powerful organizing principle transformed the book from a theoretical treatise into an incredibly useful bedside reference. A physician confronted with a patient suffering from an eye ailment, for example, could immediately turn to the relevant section and find all the accumulated knowledge on the subject, logically and clearly presented. The journey begins with the brain and the head. Avicenna provides detailed descriptions of various types of headaches and migraines, distinguishing between them with a new level of clinical precision. He offers a classic account of epilepsy and its management. Critically, it is here that he provides one of the first clear and accurate clinical descriptions of meningitis, carefully distinguishing the inflammation of the brain's membranes from other fevers and illnesses that presented with similar symptoms. This act of differential diagnosis was a hallmark of his advanced medical reasoning. From the brain, he moves downward to the senses, with extensive sections on diseases of the eyes, making the Canon a key text in the history of ophthalmology, as well as the ears, nose, and throat. The tour through the body continues into the chest, with chapters on respiratory ailments like pleurisy and pneumonia, and diseases of the heart. He then descends into the abdomen, dedicating a huge portion of the book to the complex and vital organs of digestion and excretion. He provides classic descriptions of diseases of the stomach, the intestines, the liver, and the spleen. His account of hepatitis, clearly describing the yellowing of the skin and its connection to the liver, became the standard for centuries. He wrote with particular expertise on diseases of the kidneys, providing detailed theories on the formation of kidney stones and bladder stones, and offering a range of dietary and medicinal treatments for their management and prevention. Finally, the systematic journey concludes with the extremities, addressing diseases of the joints, such as gout and arthritis, as well as ailments of the muscles, nerves, and skin. For each of the hundreds of diseases catalogued in this exhaustive head-to-toe survey, Avicenna applied a consistent and impeccable clinical method. This methodological rigor is what truly elevated the canon above all previous medical texts. For every ailment, he provided a clear six-part analysis. First, he offered a definition of the disease, establishing exactly what he was describing. Second, he listed its possible causes or etiology, drawing on the humoral theory but also on practical observation. Third, he detailed its symptoms and signs, the observable evidence that a physician would encounter in a patient. Fourth, and perhaps most impressively, he explained how to perform a differential diagnosis. He would carefully list other diseases that presented with similar symptoms and then provide the key signs a physician should look for to distinguish the true ailment from its lookalikes. This was a sophisticated level of clinical problem-solving that armed physicians with a powerful tool to avoid misdiagnosis. Fifth, he offered a prognosis, an assessment of the likely course of the illness, whether it was likely to be acute or chronic, mild or severe, and what the chances of recovery were. And sixth, based on all this information, he prescribed a detailed treatment plan. This was not a one-size-fits-all remedy. The treatment would be a holistic strategy that included specific dietary changes, modifications to lifestyle and environment, and a carefully chosen prescription of the simple and compound drugs that he had so meticulously catalogued in the second book. The third book of the canon was, therefore, a complete universe of clinical medicine. It was an incredibly practical, user-friendly guide that a working physician could rely on day in and day out. It dissected not just the human body, but the entire spectrum of human suffering, and organized it with the precision of a master librarian and the strategic vision of a great general. But Avicenna's grand system was not yet complete. His gaze extended beyond the diseases that afflicted specific individual organs. He also recognized that some ailments were general, affecting the entire body, and that the health of a single person was connected to the health of the entire community. This wider view would be the subject of his next great volume. With his exhaustive map of particular diseases complete, Avicenna expanded his view in the fourth book of the Canon to address ailments that were not confined to a single organ but could invade the entire body. He also looked beyond the individual patient to consider the health of the community as a whole. It is in this fourth book that we see some of his most forward-thinking and revolutionary ideas, concepts that would take the Western world nearly a millennium to fully grasp and implement. The book begins with a detailed discussion of general systemic illnesses. Chief among these were the fevers, which, in an age before antibiotics, were one of the primary causes of death. Avicenna performed an exhaustive classification of the different types of fever, linking them to their potential causes and prognosis, providing physicians with a crucial diagnostic tool for managing these life-threatening conditions. But the scope of the book extended far beyond fevers. It contained sections on the practice of surgery, discussing the treatment of wounds, abscesses, and the careful extraction of arrows. It also included detailed chapters on the setting of fractures and the reduction of dislocated joints, making the Canon a foundational text for the history of orthopedics for centuries to come. Demonstrating his truly holistic view of health, the fourth book also included sections on what we might now call cosmetic medicine and wellness. He wrote about the care of the skin and the hair, and offered advice on managing one's weight, discussing both obesity and how to gain weight if one was too thin. This inclusion shows a physician concerned not merely with staving off death, but with promoting a person's overall well-being and quality of life. However, the most radical and visionary part of the fourth book is where Avicenna lifts his gaze from the individual patient to the health of an entire society. It is here that he lays the foundations for the sciences of public health and epidemiology. Through meticulous observation of how diseases like tuberculosis and the plague spread through cities, he arrived at a stunningly modern conclusion. He theorized that these illnesses were not caused by divine punishment or bad air in a vague sense, but by a form of contagion. He hypothesized that the sickness was transmitted by what he called miasma, tiny, invisible, infectious particles or seeds that traveled through the air and water, passing the disease from one person to another. This was an incredible leap of pure logical deduction. Nearly 800 years before Louis Pasteur and the development of germ theory, and without the aid of a single microscope to see the bacteria and viruses he was postulating, Avicenna had correctly identified the fundamental mechanism of infectious disease. And from this brilliant theory, he derived a set of public health measures that are astonishingly familiar to us today. He was the first to formally recommend the isolation of sick individuals to prevent the spread of their illness to the healthy population. He even proposed a specific 40-day period of isolation for travelers and the sick during epidemics. It is widely believed that this practice, which he called arborania in Arabic, is the direct conceptual and etymological root of the term we use today, quarantine. He further advised that the clothes, utensils, and living quarters of an infected person should be thoroughly cleansed and disinfected to destroy any lingering infectious seeds. And he wrote at length about the critical importance of ensuring a clean and unpolluted water supply for a city, recognizing it as a primary vector for the spread of deadly disease. He was describing the basic principles that governments worldwide would finally adopt centuries later to combat great plagues and pandemics. To complete his colossal work, Avicenna added a fifth and final book, the Acrabidon, which served as a practical formulary or pharmacopoeia. If the second book was the theoretical encyclopedia of simple drugs, the fifth book was the master recipe book for compound medicines. It contained the detailed formulas for more than 650 complex remedies, including syrups, pills, electuaries, and ointments. It also included recipes for the famously complex antidotes known as theriacs, which contained dozens of ingredients. It was the definitive pharmacy manual of its age, the practical culmination of all his pharmacological theory. With these 5 books, the universe of the canon was complete. It was a total system of medicine. It began with the philosophy of how to live a healthy life and ended with the precise recipe for the final syrup. It ranged from the diagnosis of a single individual's emotional state to the protection of an entire community from pestilence. The work was so comprehensive, so logically structured, and so immensely useful that its authority became almost absolute. For more than 600 years, in both the great centers of the Islamic world and in the new universities of Europe, to learn medicine meant, first and foremost, to learn the Canon of Avicenna. While Avicenna was composing the ordered and logical universe of the Canon of Medicine, the man himself was living a life that was anything but orderly. It would be a grave mistake to imagine him as a reclusive scholar, sitting peacefully in a library tower, surrounded only by his books. The reality is that his greatest works were forged in the crucible of a life defined by political instability, courtly intrigue, and mortal danger. After the fall of the Samanid dynasty, his great patrons, Avicenna spent a large portion of his adult life as a wanderer, moving from one court to another across the fragmented landscape of Persia. His extraordinary skill as a physician was his passport and his shield. The local emirs and princes, often locked in petty wars and rivalries, all competed to have the most famous doctor of the age in their service. His reputation was a form of currency that granted him access and protection wherever he went. After leaving his homeland, he traveled through various cities, eventually making his way to the court of Hamadan, in what is now western Iran. It was here, in the service of the local Bayad Emir, that his life would take its most dramatic and dangerous turn. The ruler of Hamadan, an emir named Shams al-Dawla, was struck by a severe and agonizing case of colic. The pain was so intense that it incapacitated him, and once again the local court physicians, with all their traditional remedies, were completely helpless. As word of the emir's grave condition spread, Avicenna's name was inevitably mentioned. He was summoned to the palace. Drawing on his superior diagnostic skills and his deep knowledge of pharmacology, he was able to successfully treat the emir, alleviating his suffering and restoring him to health. The emir was profoundly impressed. But he was captivated not only by Avicenna's medical prowess but by the sheer breadth and power of his intellect. In their conversations, he discovered a mind that moved with effortless grace from medicine to philosophy, from astronomy to poetry, from matters of state to the nature of the soul. Shams al-Dawla decided that a mind this brilliant was wasted on simply being a physician. He saw in Avicenna a man of profound wisdom and sound judgment, someone who could be an invaluable advisor. And so, he made an astonishing decision. He appointed Avicenna not just as his personal court physician, but to the highest and most powerful political office in the emirate. He made him vizier. Suddenly, the philosopher became a politician. The scholar became a statesman. This was not a position Avicenna had sought. It thrust him into a world for which he was not prepared, a world of backroom deals, treacherous alliances, and the constant threat of conspiracy. It was a role that demanded his time and energy, pulling him away from his true passion, the quiet pursuit of knowledge. He was forced to lead an exhausting double life. By day, Avicenna was the chief administrator of the state. He found himself immersed in the practical and often ugly business of governing. He was responsible for managing the state's finances, dealing with diplomatic correspondence, advising the emir on military strategy, and attempting to bring order to a corrupt and inefficient bureaucracy. He had to contend with ambitious rivals, placate powerful generals, and navigate the delicate and often deadly currents of court life. He was no longer just an observer of the world. He was a key actor on its chaotic stage. But when night fell, the vizier would disappear, and the philosopher would emerge. He would gather his small, loyal circle of students and disciples in his private quarters. As the political world of Hamadan slept, Avicenna's real work would begin. By the light of oil lamps, he would continue the true work of his life. He would lecture on logic and metaphysics. He would debate the ideas of Aristotle. And, most remarkably, he would continue to dictate, purely from his perfect memory, the towering chapters of his great encyclopedias, the Canon of Medicine and the Book of Healing. His student and biographer, Al-Juzjani, would faithfully write it all down, capturing the torrent of knowledge that flowed from his master's mind. This nightly ritual demonstrates a level of intellectual energy and mental stamina that is almost superhuman. However, power, especially for an outsider, is a dangerous game. His position, his influence, and his closeness to the emir earned him powerful enemies. The most dangerous of these were the military commanders. The Buyid army was largely composed of Turkic and Dalamite mercenaries, hardened soldiers who respected strength and the sword above all else. They deeply resented this Persian scholar, this man of the pen, holding power over them, the men of the sword. They viewed his attempts at financial and administrative reform as a threat to their own influence and income. They saw his philosophical pursuits as strange and perhaps even heretical. To them, he was an arrogant intellectual who had no place running a government. The tension between the scholar vizier and the military chiefs began to build, creating a powder keg in the heart of the court that was ready to explode. The fragile peace of the Hamadan court, held together by the emir's respect for his brilliant vizier, was destined to shatter. The resentment of the military commanders, simmering for months, finally boiled over into open rebellion. The army, feeling their influence and income threatened by Avicenna's administrative reforms, mutinied. Chaos erupted in the city. The mercenary troops stormed through the streets, their destination the emir's palace. They surrounded the royal compound, their demands loud and uncompromising. They did not ask for more pay or better conditions. They demanded the dismissal and execution of the scholar vizier who they believed was usurping their power. They ransacked Avicenna's house, a symbolic act of destruction against the man of the pen, and laid siege to the palace, issuing a stark ultimatum to the emir: surrender Avicenna or face a full-blown coup. The emir, Shams al-Dawla, was trapped. He was a ruler whose authority rested entirely on the sharp-edged loyalty of the very soldiers now demanding his vizier's head. He valued Avicenna's wisdom, and the man had, after all, saved his life. But to defy his entire army would be political suicide. Forced into an impossible corner, he made the only choice he could to save his throne. He formally dismissed Avicenna from the post of vizier and sent word to the rebellious troops that their demand had been met. To save his life, Avicenna was forced to flee and go into hiding, sheltered by an associate who was loyal to him. For 40 days, the most powerful intellectual of his age lived as a fugitive, the threat of discovery and death hanging over him at every moment. He had gone from the pinnacle of power to the shadows of a backroom in an instant. Then, in a stunning twist of fate, the emir's own body intervened. Shams al-Dawla, the very ruler who had been forced to cast out his savior, fell ill once more with the same agonizing colic that had afflicted him before. The military, having won their political victory, stood by helplessly as their commander's health failed. The court physicians were summoned again, and again they were powerless. As the emir's condition worsened, he came to a stark realization. The only man in the world who could save him was the very man he had been forced to condemn. Secret messengers were dispatched into the city, tasked with finding the fugitive scholar. Avicenna was located in his hiding place and brought back to the palace under the cover of night. He was no longer a disgraced official but the court's last and only hope. He once again applied his medical skill, and once again he cured the emir. Having saved the ruler's life for a second time, his position was now unassailable. He was triumphantly and publicly reinstated as vizier, to the silent fury of his military enemies. His intellectual power had, for the moment, proven stronger than the sword. But this second turn of fortune was temporary, built on the lifespan of a single grateful patient. After the death of his protector, Emir Shams al-Dawla, Avicenna's position in Hamadan became instantly precarious. The new ruler did not share his predecessor's trust in the philosopher, and his old enemies in the court and the army saw their opportunity for revenge. They concocted a charge against him that was impossible to defend against: treason. They accused him of carrying on a secret, treacherous correspondence with the ruler of the rival city of Isfahan. This time, there was no one to protect him. Avicenna was formally charged as an enemy of the state, arrested, and taken from the capital. He was imprisoned in a remote and formidable fortress named Fardajan. He who had commanded a government was now a prisoner of one. He had reached the lowest point of his life, stripped of his power, his freedom, and his access to the world of learning. But while his body could be confined, his mind could not. Far from sinking into despair in the solitude of his prison cell, Avicenna found a strange kind of freedom. Freed from the crushing daily duties of a vizier, his mind was once again his own. He used the forced quiet and isolation to continue his true work. It is a testament to his incredible resilience and intellectual power that during his 4 months of imprisonment, he composed several significant works. He wrote philosophical treatises, allegorical stories, and even poetry. He did all of this without access to his vast personal library, writing purely from the perfectly organized universe of knowledge that he carried within his own memory. The state had locked away the man, but they could not imprison the mind that had built the Canon of Medicine. While the Canon of Medicine was Avicenna's monumental effort to heal the human body, he was simultaneously engaged in an even grander and more ambitious project. This was his attempt to diagnose and cure the ailments of the human mind itself. This colossal undertaking would become his other great masterpiece, an encyclopedic work of philosophy and science known as the Kitab Al-Shifa, which translates to the Book of Healing. To truly understand Avicenna's intellectual universe, one must first understand the profound meaning of this title. The healing, or Shifa, that he is referring to here is not the healing of the body from physical disease. He had already addressed that in the canon. This was a remedy for a much deeper and more universal affliction, the disease of ignorance. The Book of Healing was intended as a cure for the soul, a guide for the human mind to escape the darkness of error and confusion and ascend to the light of true, certain knowledge through the power of reason. If the canon was a monumental work, the Shifa is on an even more colossal scale. It is one of the most comprehensive encyclopedias of knowledge ever written by a single individual. It was Avicenna's attempt to summarize and systematize the entire body of philosophical and scientific knowledge available to him, correcting the ancients where he believed they had erred and adding his own profound insights. Like the canon, it was not composed in a quiet, single stretch of time. He worked on it for over 20 years, throughout his travels and his turbulent political career, often dictating long passages from memory to his students during their nightly sessions. The sheer existence of the book is a testament to his incredible mental discipline and the vast, perfectly organized library he carried within his own mind. He structured this great encyclopedia according to the classical Aristotelian division of the sciences, a grand pyramid of knowledge that mirrored the one he had climbed in his youth. The entire work is divided into 4 major parts. The first and foundational part is logic. Avicenna saw logic as Aristotle did, not as a science in itself, but as the essential tool, the organon that makes all other sciences possible. This section is a complete manual on the art and science of correct reasoning, the indispensable instrument for his cure of ignorance. The second and largest part of the work is dedicated to the natural sciences. This is his systematic account of the entire physical world. It includes what we would now call physics, discussing motion, time, and the nature of the elements. It covers botany and zoology, analyzing the principles of plant and animal life. And at its heart lies his detailed exploration of psychology, or the science of the soul, nafs, which he considered a part of natural science as it is the principle of life within a natural body. The third part covers the mathematical sciences, the disciplines of the classical quadrivium. This section encompasses arithmetic, the study of number, geometry, the study of space and form, astronomy, the study of the celestial bodies and their perfect, ordered movements, and even music, which in the classical tradition was considered a mathematical science dealing with harmony, ratios, and proportion. Finally, at the very summit of the pyramid of knowledge, the culmination of the entire work, is the fourth part, metaphysics. This was the first philosophy, the ultimate science that deals with the most fundamental questions of existence. It is here that Avicenna seeks to provide a rational, logical proof for the existence of God and to understand the nature of ultimate reality. At the very heart of this vast intellectual project, woven through his discussions of natural science and metaphysics, lies the single question that fascinated Avicenna more than any other. What is the soul? What is this I, this consciousness that experiences the world? Is the soul merely a function of the body, a complex set of biological processes that ignites at birth and is extinguished at death, like the flame of a candle? Or is it something more, something different? Is it an independent, immaterial substance, a spiritual entity that inhabits the body but is not defined by it, and which is therefore potentially immortal? For the theologians, the answer to this question was a matter of faith and scriptural revelation. But for Avicenna the philosopher, that was not enough. His cure for ignorance demanded a proof based not on faith, but on pure, irrefutable reason. He sought to demonstrate the independent existence of the soul with the same logical certainty as a geometric theorem. To achieve this, to prove to a rational mind that its own awareness is not a product of the physical brain, Avicenna devised one of the most elegant, ingenious, and enduring thought experiments in the entire history of human philosophy. To provide a rational philosophical proof for the soul's existence, Avicenna knew he could not rely on faith or revealed texts. He needed an argument so fundamental, so stripped of all external distractions, that it would be undeniable to any thinking person. To achieve this, he devised a brilliant and powerful thought experiment, an invitation for us to enter a state of pure consciousness. It has become known as the argument of the flying man or the suspended man. He asks us to perform this experiment in our own minds. Imagine, he says, a person created in a single instant, fully mature and perfectly formed. But this person is not created on the earth or in any familiar environment. They are created suspended in a void. The air around them is perfectly calm and temperate, so they feel no wind, no heat, and no cold. Their limbs are spread apart, so that no part of their body touches any other part. They are floating, weightless, in a silent, empty space. Now Avicenna begins to strip away the senses, one by one. Imagine, he says, that this person's eyes are veiled, so they can perceive no light, no darkness, no shape, and no color. The world is visually blank. Imagine that the void is perfectly silent, so there are no sounds to be heard. The world is acoustically empty. Imagine there are no odors in the air and nothing to taste. The senses of smell and taste are useless. Imagine that they are suspended in such a way that they feel no external pressure, not even the resistance of the air. The sense of touch provides no information. This person is in a state of total sensory deprivation. They are receiving zero input from the outside world. But Avicenna goes one step further, and this is the most crucial part of the experiment. He asks us to imagine that this person also has no awareness of their own physical body. They cannot feel their heart beating, their lungs expanding, or the blood coursing through their veins. They have no proprioception, no sense of the position of their limbs in space. They have no memory of ever having had a body. They have no knowledge of bones, or muscles, or organs. Their physical form is a complete and total unknown to them. All that exists is a point of pure, disembodied awareness, a mind created fully functional but with no memories and no sensory data to process. Having established this state of absolute oblivion, Avicenna poses his central question. Can this person, this suspended man, be certain of his own existence? In this void, deprived of all external and internal physical sensation, can he still affirm that I am? Avicenna's answer is a resounding and unequivocal yes. Even in that profound emptiness, the suspended man would know without the slightest shadow of a doubt that he exists. He would be aware of his own self. He would be conscious of his own consciousness. While he could not affirm the existence of his hands, his feet, or any part of the external world, he could not possibly deny the existence of the self that is doing the thinking. The very act of being aware is its own proof. He would know with absolute certainty, I exist, and from this simple, powerful conclusion, Avicenna draws his revolutionary proof. The logic is as elegant as it is profound. If this man can be absolutely certain of his own existence, his self, his soul, his consciousness, while at the same time being completely unaware and uncertain of the existence of his own body, then his self, his soul, his consciousness must be something distinct and separate from his body. The body is not an essential part of his identity, but something external to his core self. The knowledge that the soul has of itself is direct, immediate, and does not depend on the senses or any physical experience. Therefore, Avicenna concludes, the soul is a real, immaterial, and independent substance. It is not a byproduct of the body. It is an entity in and of itself. This ingenious argument, formulated in the heart of the 11th century, is a stunning precursor to the famous statement made by the French philosopher René Descartes almost 600 years later, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Both arguments seek to establish the certainty of the self over the uncertainty of the material world. But in many ways, Avicenna's flying man is even more radical. Descartes' argument begins with the act of doubting, an act of thought about the world. Avicenna's argument strips away even that, positing a state of pure self-awareness without any thought of an external world to doubt. With this single, elegant thought experiment, Avicenna believed he had laid a new, rational foundation for the study of the soul. He had proven to his satisfaction that the I we all experience is not a temporary illusion produced by our brains, but a real, immaterial entity. This proof was the critical first step in his larger philosophical project. It allowed him to then ask the next set of profound questions. If the soul is immaterial, how does it connect with and command a material body? How does this non-physical self use a physical brain to perceive and understand the world? And ultimately, what is the destiny of this soul after the body perishes? Having established through his flying man argument that the soul was an independent, immaterial substance, Avicenna was confronted with the next great logical challenge. If the soul is not physical, how does it interact with the physical world? How does this non-physical I govern a material body, and how does it use a physical brain to perceive, remember, and understand? To answer this, Avicenna developed one of the most sophisticated and detailed models of the mind, or psychologies, in the history of thought. He created a veritable map of consciousness, describing a complex hierarchy of faculties and powers that bridge the gap between the spiritual self and the material world. According to Avicenna, the soul is not a single, simple entity. It is a hierarchy of functions or faculties, each with a specific role. At the most fundamental level lies the vegetative soul. This is the faculty we share with all living things, including plants. It is the body's basic operating system, responsible for the automatic vital functions that sustain life without any conscious thought. Nutrition, growth, and reproduction. Above this lies the animal soul, which we share with animals. This faculty is far more complex and is divided into two main powers: the power of movement and the power of perception. The power of movement is what compels us to seek out what we desire and avoid what we fear. But it is the power of perception that is truly intricate. This begins with the 5 external senses that we are all familiar with: sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. These are our windows to the world, gathering the raw data of physical reality. But here is where Avicenna's genius shines. He argued that this raw data does not pass directly to our higher intellect. First, it must be processed in the brain through a series of 5 internal senses. To understand this, imagine a sheep seeing a wolf for the first time. The first internal sense is the common sense. This is not good judgment, but a faculty that acts as a central processing unit for the external senses. The sheep's eye sees a gray, furry shape. Its ear hears a low growl. The common sense takes these separate streams of data and synthesizes them into a single, unified, coherent perception: the object wolf. The second internal sense is representation or fantasy. This is the faculty that stores these unified sensory images. It is the sheep's mental picture, its memory, of what the wolf looked and sounded like. It's the brain's hard drive for sensory information. The third is imagination. This faculty acts as the workshop of the mind. It can take the stored images from the representation and combine or separate them. For example, it can combine the image of a horse with the image of a bird to create the idea of a winged horse, something it has never actually seen. The fourth internal sense is the most subtle and brilliant of all: estimation. This is the faculty that perceives non-physical, non-sensible intentions in perceived objects. The sheep's external senses only perceive the wolf's color, shape, and sound. But its estimative faculty instantly perceives the non-physical quality of danger, threat, and hostility. In humans, this is our intuition or our gut feeling. Our ability to instantly sense whether a person is friendly or a situation is safe, without any logical reasoning. And the fifth internal sense is memory. This is the storage center for these non-sensible intentions that are perceived by the estimation. The sheep not only perceives the immediate danger of the wolf, but it stores this judgment in its memory, so that in the future, it will remember that wolves are hostile. This entire complex system of 5 internal senses, common sense, representation, imagination, estimation, and memory, constitutes the animal soul's power of perception. It is a sophisticated information processing system that prepares and organizes sensory data. And it is upon this prepared foundation that the highest and uniquely human faculty operates: the rational soul. According to Avicenna, the rational soul takes the processed images and intentions from the internal senses and performs the most miraculous operation of all: abstraction. From the perception of many individual, particular horses, the intellect abstracts the universal concept of horseness. From witnessing many individual acts of bravery, it abstracts the universal idea of courage. Abstraction is the power to see the universal form within the particular example. This is how we move from simply perceiving the world to truly understanding it. This detailed model of the mind is breathtaking in its complexity and insight. It describes a clear flow of information from the external world, through a series of specific processing centers in the brain, culminating in abstract thought. It is an intricate cognitive map that bears a striking resemblance to modern models of cognitive science. But this detailed map only led Avicenna to an even deeper and more fundamental question. If our intellect is capable of grasping these eternal and universal truths, where does the light of reason that makes this possible ultimately come from? The question that concluded Avicenna's intricate map of the mind, where does the light of pure reason come from, led him to the final and highest ascent in his entire philosophical system. It took him beyond the physics of the material world and into the realm of metaphysics. For Avicenna, this was the first science, the ultimate discipline, because it did not ask about the properties of any particular thing that exists, but about the nature of existence itself. It confronted the most profound question a human being can ask. Why is there something rather than nothing? His answer to this question is one of the most powerful and influential logical constructions in the history of thought. To begin, Avicenna asks us to look at the world around us and at ourselves. Every single thing we can perceive, a tree, a stone, a star, our own body, shares one fundamental characteristic. Its existence is not guaranteed. A tree might never have sprouted. A stone can be ground into dust. We ourselves did not exist before we were born and will cease to exist after we die. In philosophical terms, these are all possible beings, or contingent beings. A possible being is one whose essence, its fundamental what-ness, does not include its own existence. It can exist or it cannot exist. For a possible being to move from mere possibility to actual existence, it requires an external cause. A child requires parents to exist. A clay pot requires a potter. This reality immediately presents us with a chain of causes and effects. We were caused by our parents, who were in turn caused by their parents, and so on. Every cause is itself the effect of a prior cause. Now, Avicenna argues, we are faced with a logical problem. What if this chain of possible beings causing other possible beings stretches backwards into the past forever? If the chain of causes is infinite, we are left with no ultimate explanation for why anything exists right now. It would be like seeing a chain of lamps, each one hanging from the one above it. If that chain goes up forever, with no first lamp ever being attached to a solid ceiling, the entire chain would have no support. It would simply fall into the void of non-existence. Logic, Avicenna insists, demands that the chain must have a beginning. Therefore, there must exist, by sheer logical necessity, a first cause that is not like anything else in the chain. This first cause cannot be just another possible being, because then we would have to ask what caused it. This first link in the great chain of being must be of a completely unique nature. It must be a being whose very essence is its existence. It is a being that cannot not exist. Its existence is self-sufficient and uncaused. It is not merely possible. It is absolutely necessary. This is what Avicenna famously termed the necessary existent. This necessary existent is Avicenna's ultimate philosophical definition of God. Not a God taken from a specific scripture, but a God whose existence is demanded by pure, inescapable reason. And this logical proof had a profound and controversial consequence for how he understood creation. For Avicenna, the necessary existent, being perfect, eternal, and unchanging, did not decide to create the world at a particular moment in time, as a human artisan decides to make something. Such a decision would imply a change in God, from not creating to creating, and a perfect being cannot change. Instead, Avicenna argued that the entire universe must flow or emanate from the nature of the necessary existent as an eternal and logical consequence of its being. He used the analogy of the sun and its light. The sun does not decide to shine at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. Shining is its essential and eternal nature. Light flows from it constantly and necessarily. In the same way, the universe, with all its chains of cause and effect, emanates eternally from the nature of God. This led him to one of his most famous and contentious conclusions. If the universe emanates necessarily from a God who is eternal, then the universe itself must also be eternal. It had no beginning in time, even though its existence at every single moment is entirely dependent on its first cause, the necessary existent. From his purely philosophical perspective, this was a logically impeccable conclusion. But it placed him on a direct collision course with the literal interpretation of creation found in the Quran and the Bible. which described a specific moment of creation in time by a willful act of God. It was this bold conclusion, derived from the cold, hard light of reason, that formed the very peak of his cure for ignorance, but would also draw the fiercest fire from the more orthodox theologians of his time and for centuries to come. While Avicenna's mind was busy constructing these eternal and perfectly ordered systems of thought, the man himself lived a life of intense, earthly, and often turbulent experience. To truly understand his monumental achievements, we must look beyond the legend of the great physician and philosopher and meet the man himself, a figure far more complex, vibrant, and human than the marble statues of his legacy might suggest. He was not a detached saint or a dry, thinking machine, but a man of immense appetites, for knowledge, for debate, for music, for wine, and for life itself. One of the most frequently noted aspects of his personality was a supreme and unshakable self-confidence, which his enemies often perceived as sheer arrogance. This is, perhaps, an unsurprising trait for a mind that so rarely encountered its equal. From the moment he surpassed his first tutors as a boy, he was acutely aware of his own intellectual superiority. His famous claim that medicine was not one of the difficult sciences was not an insult to other physicians, but a simple statement of fact from his perspective. For a mind that had scaled the absolute peaks of metaphysics, the empirical nature of medicine seemed less daunting. This confidence was his armor in the treacherous world of court politics and the engine of his ambition. But it also won him powerful and dangerous enemies who bristled at his intellectual authority. This powerful mind was housed in a body possessed of almost superhuman energy and stamina. The most vivid illustration of this is the double life he led during his time as vizier in Hamadan. His student and biographer, Al-Juzjani, who was his loyal companion for 25 years, provides a detailed portrait of their routine. The day was consumed by the draining and often tedious affairs of state, managing finances, settling disputes, dealing with military dispatches, and navigating the constant web of courtly intrigue. For most men, this would be an exhaustive career in itself. For Avicenna, it was merely the prelude to his real work. When night fell, his true life would begin. He and his circle of students, with Juzjani at their head, would gather. After a meal, often accompanied by wine which Avicenna valued for its ability to refresh the spirit after a long day, the sessions would start. He would lecture, his students would ask questions, and intense debates would rage until the early hours of the morning. Then, the most remarkable part of the night would commence, the act of composition. Avicenna would begin to dictate, purely from memory, the great works that would shape the future. Juzjani would write furiously, trying to keep up as his master, without consulting a single note, dictated a long and complex passage on the anatomy of the eye from the Canon of Medicine. On the next night, it might be a dense, philosophical chapter on the nature of the soul from the Book of Healing. This nightly routine of high-level politics followed by world-changing intellectual creation demonstrates a capacity for work and concentration that is difficult to comprehend. He was not a solitary recluse. The loyalty he inspired in his students, particularly in Al-Juzjani, speaks to a charismatic and compelling personality. Juzjani's biography is not just a record of a great mind, but a portrait of a beloved master. It is through Juzjani's eyes that we see Avicenna the man, celebrating breakthroughs with his students, finding solace in music, and facing political disaster with a philosopher's resolve. His more personal side is also revealed in his poetry, which he composed mostly in his native Persian tongue. In these verses, we meet a different Avicenna from the grand systematizer of the encyclopedias. We find a more introspective and spiritual man, grappling with the great themes of the human condition. In his most famous poem, the Ode on the Soul, he uses the powerful metaphor of the soul as a celestial dove, a divine being, that has been tragically ensnared in the cage of the physical body and longs to return to its heavenly home. His poems reflect on the fleeting nature of life, the inevitability of death, and the soul's quest for a truth that lies beyond the material world. Avicenna was, in the end, a man of profound contrasts. He was a rationalist who analyzed the universe with cold, hard logic, yet he was also a mystic who wrote of the soul's yearning for the divine. He was a powerful statesman who commanded a government, yet his true kingdom was the immaterial world of ideas. He was a physician dedicated to preserving the health of the body, yet he enjoyed the earthly pleasures of wine and music. It is this complete, complex, and sometimes contradictory portrait that allows us to appreciate the true scale of his genius. He was not a disembodied intellect, but a complete man, and it was this vibrant, tireless, and brilliant humanity that fueled his immortal legacy. After his escape from the fortress of Fardajan, reportedly disguised as a Sufi dervish, Avicenna finally found a lasting refuge. He spent the final 14 years of his life in the brilliant city of Isfahan, under the stable and appreciative patronage of its ruler. These were years of relative peace and extraordinary productivity, a calm after the storm of his political career. In Isfahan, he was no longer a politician, but a revered scientific advisor and the head of his own vibrant intellectual circle. It was here that he was able to complete and refine his great encyclopedias, putting the final touches on the monumental works that had been composed in palaces, in hiding, and in prison cells. His life, which had been a relentless journey of the mind, came to a peaceful end around the year 1037. He fell gravely ill while accompanying his patron on a military expedition back to Hamadan, the very city where he had once been a powerful vizier and a hunted fugitive. He was 57 years old. According to his biographer, he faced his own death not with fear, but with the serene composure of a philosopher. He put his worldly affairs in order, distributed his wealth to the poor, and freed his servants. The man was gone. But his mind, encapsulated in the vast body of his written work, was about to embark on its greatest and longest journey. His loyal students, especially his devoted biographer Al-Juzjani, immediately took on the sacred task of ensuring his legacy. They collected, edited, and copied his manuscripts. The influence of his work spread rapidly throughout the Islamic world. The Canon of Medicine, in particular, was recognized as a work of unparalleled genius. It quickly became the standard medical authority in every major center of learning, from Cordoba in Spain to Samarkand in Central Asia. For centuries, to be a great physician in the Islamic world meant to be a master of the Canon of Avicenna. But the most extraordinary chapter of his legacy had not yet begun. It would unfold in a different continent, in a different culture, and in a different language. The bridge between these two worlds was the Iberian Peninsula, the land known as Al-Andalus, or medieval Spain. In the 11th and 12th centuries, as Christian kingdoms began to reconquer the peninsula from Muslim rule, they encountered a civilization of incredible sophistication. In cities like Toledo, they discovered magnificent libraries, filled with treasures of Arabic learning that were vastly superior to anything known in the rest of Europe. This moment of cultural collision created one of the most fruitful intellectual exchanges in history. Into this vibrant melting pot of cultures came an Italian scholar named Gerard of Cremona. He had traveled to Toledo on a specific quest to find a copy of Ptolemy's Almagest, the great ancient work of astronomy, which was only available in Arabic. But once he arrived in Toledo, he realized he had stumbled upon an entire universe of knowledge he never knew existed. He dedicated the rest of his life, with a feverish passion, to translating these Arabic works into Latin, the language of scholarship in the West. Working with a team of local scholars, he translated more than 70 major books from Arabic, single-handedly reintroducing a massive body of scientific and philosophical knowledge to a Europe that was just beginning to awaken from its intellectual slumber. His single most monumental achievement was the complete translation of Avicenna's Al-Qanun fi al-Tibb, the Canon of Medicine. When this work arrived in Europe, it was like a flood of light pouring into a dark room. European medicine at the time was a rudimentary and disorganized affair, based on fragmented Latin summaries of Greek texts, folklore, and monastic traditions. It lacked a coherent system, a logical foundation, and a comprehensive clinical guide. The Canon provided all three. It was a complete, systematic, rational, and eminently practical gift of knowledge, the likes of which Europe had never seen. The impact was immediate, overwhelming, and transformative. The Canon was adopted as the fundamental and authoritative medical textbook in the new universities that were springing up across the continent. In Bologna and Padua, the great medical schools of Italy, in Montpellier and Paris in France, in Oxford in England, the curriculum of medicine was built around the study of Avicenna's masterpiece. For the next 600 years, from the 12th century well into the 17th, the education of a European physician consisted, in large part, of memorizing, studying, and writing commentaries on the work of the great Persian master. After the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, the Canon was one of the very first medical books to be printed, and it went through more than 30 editions. It became the final word, the supreme authority. In a medical debate, to be able to quote the Canon was to win the argument. For centuries, contradicting Avicenna was as unthinkable as contradicting the Bible in a theological dispute. The physician who had died in Hamadan, Persia, had been reborn in the West under his Latinized name Avicenna, and had posthumously become the undisputed master of all European medicine, a title he would hold for half a millennium. The Prince of Physicians. The story of Avicenna resonates across 1,000 years, a testament to the enduring power of a single human mind to shape the course of history. Today, his name is honored in different ways across the world. In his Persian homeland, he is a national hero, a symbol of a golden age of civilization and a source of immense cultural pride. To the wider Islamic world, he represents the pinnacle of rational inquiry within their intellectual tradition. To the West, his name is synonymous with the crucial role that Islamic civilization played in preserving, transmitting, and building upon the classical knowledge that would form the bedrock of the European Renaissance. But perhaps the most accurate way to understand his universal and timeless legacy is to see him as the great bridge builder. First, Avicenna built a bridge between the past and the future. He stood at a pivotal moment in history, looking back to rescue the immense intellectual treasures of ancient Greece. He did not simply save the works of Aristotle and Galen. He absorbed them, wrestled with them, and then gave them a new, systematic, and robust form. He organized this ancient wisdom into a coherent structure so powerful that it could serve as the unshakable foundation for human knowledge for the next millennium. He provided the intellectual rails upon which both Islamic and European thought would run for centuries, a foundation that had to be reckoned with before the next great leaps of the scientific revolution could be made. He also built a bridge between cultures and religions. He was a Persian who wrote in Arabic, the scientific lingua franca of his day. His work, born from the heart of Islamic civilization, would cross every conceivable border to become the undisputed authority in the great universities of Christian Europe. His journey, both in life and in legacy, proves that the quest for truth is a universal human enterprise, one that transcends the boundaries of empire, faith, and language. He demonstrated that a great idea belongs not to the culture that birthed it, but to all of humanity. Furthermore, Avicenna dedicated his life to building a bridge between faith and reason. Although he was fiercely criticized by the more orthodox theologians of his time, his entire philosophical project was a grand and sincere attempt to show that philosophy and divine revelation were not enemies. He believed they were two wings with which the human soul could fly toward the same, singular divine truth. He sought to demonstrate through the cold, hard light of logic the same ultimate realities that faith accepted through revelation. His work represents one of history's most ambitious efforts to harmonize the rational intellect with the spiritual heart. And finally, and perhaps most profoundly, Avicenna built the most crucial bridge of all, the bridge between the body and the soul. He was, uniquely, a master of both realms. He was the great physician of the body, the author of the Canon of Medicine, and the great philosopher of the mind, the author of the Book of Healing. He understood, with a clarity almost unparalleled in his time, that these two were not separate domains, but were inextricably and profoundly linked. His ideas on preventive medicine, his focus on the importance of diet, environment, and lifestyle, and most of all, his revolutionary insight into how our emotions can cause deep and serious physical illnesses, are more relevant today than ever before. In a modern world that is rediscovering the importance of holistic and psychosomatic health, we are, in many ways, just catching up to the integrated vision of human wellness that Avicenna laid out 1,000 years ago. The story of Avicenna is, in the end, the story of the limitless potential of a single, disciplined, and passionate mind. In an age of war, political chaos, and constant exile, he was able to create entire universes of order, clarity, and reason. His life is a testament to the power of perseverance and an insatiable thirst for knowledge. He proved that a person can not only understand the world, but can also give it a new shape, a new order, and a new direction. Avicenna did not just live in history. He carved his own channels for it to flow through, and the great intellectual bridges that he built still stand today.